Hi again then guys, and welcome to my 25th pick in my top 30 selection of dream cars which I would love to see feature on a GranTurismo game if we ever got the chance. For the vast majority of these that's probably not going to happen, but for one or two there is a possibility that we may see them on the game. And I've mentioned before on this channel that I believe GranTurismo is sorely lacking, as are many racing game franchises, in one particular type of vehicle: vintage cars. Very, very few racing games have a decent amount of vintage cars. Not just racing cars, but any vintage cars. As GranTurismo currently stands, we only have a couple of vintage cars on the game, most notably the Audi V16 Streamliner, which, it has to be said, is a very good car under certain circumstances. But the showing for vintage cars on GranTurismo has, funnily enough, actually got worse over recent years. The best GranTurismo game to date for vintage cars was actually GranTurismo 4, which I personally believe is the best all-round GranTurismo game so far. On that game, we had the Audi Streamliner, the Ford Model T, and both of the 1886 Mercedes-Benz motor wagons, which are essentially the first cars ever made. Now that's at least 4 models. On GranTurismo 6 we now only have 2 or 3. So it's actually gotten worse. This car is one of the most appropriate vintage cars to be featured on a GranTurismo game. It's from 1925 and it's called the Doble E20. It uses a completely different power source to any other car on GranTurismo, any other car that has ever been on GranTurismo in fact, because it's a steam car. It's completely silent, like an electric vehicle, but in its time, and to be honest, even by today's standards, some of the specs of this car are seriously impressive. Many cars from back then weren't exactly exciting by modern standards, especially if they were to be included on a racing game. This car would actually give some vehicles on GranTurismo a pretty decent run for their money. Now the car is powered, obviously, by a steam engine, as we said, and the specs are slightly unusual. It only produces around 150 horsepower, but it also puts out more torque than a Veyron. 1,000 pound-feet. It doesn't have a gearbox, because it doesn't need one, it has so much torque, and it's rear-wheel drive. It can hit 60 miles per hour in around 9 seconds. Now on the game that doesn't sound that good, but by today's standards that is still as quick as a lower level modern hot hatch. From a car from 1925 with no gears that weighs over 5,000 pounds. That's pretty impressive. The top speed is also in excess of 120 miles per hour, which back then was an absolute monster. There was almost nothing else which you could buy which was capable of that kind of speed, especially from a street car. Now, the owner of the most notable model which I would like to see featured on the game is Leno, and I've included in the description of this video a link to Jay Leno's garage video featuring this car, because he goes into detail on how the car works and what it's like to actually drive, what it's like to own, and obviously being the owner of the car he is far more qualified to talk about it than I am. What I'm primarily talking about in this video is why I want it featured on GranTurismo, and also how I believe it would fit into the current roster of the game. Now the reason why I want it on GranTurismo is a number of reasons. I've already mentioned that we do not have enough vintage and also by extension classic cars featured on the game. Now it's fair enough that there are a lot of young players on GranTurismo, many of whom who are not as much petrol heads as others probably don't care so much about classic and especially vintage cars, and that's understandable. It's very easy to view them as slightly boring, outdated, slow and kind of pointless to have on a racing game. But and this is probably the most valid for Gran Turismo instead of other games like Forza. In the case of Gran Turismo, there are a large proportion of older players. Not necessarily old people, but older players. And those older players, in more times than not, love classic cars and vintage cars and would like to have more to be able to use on the game. I know I personally would love to. I'm a huge fan of classic cars, not necessarily the biggest fan of vintage cars, but when there are vintage cars that stand out as much as this one does, I'm definitely a fan of it, and I would always love to see new powertrains and new power types feature on Gran Turismo for diversity. We currently have petrols, we have 2 or 3 diesels, we have some electric cars, some hybrids, and even a laser car. We don't have any steam cars, and the selection of steam cars that have been built, primarily in the case of vintage cars, aren't necessarily all that strong. Most of them aren't particularly quick. This one, though, is by far the quickest steam car ever made, and is even still quick by today's standards. For its power, 150 horsepower, to hit 60 in 9 seconds or thereabouts is remarkably good. You try and make a modern car with 150 horsepower hit 60 in 9 seconds with a weight of over 5,000 pounds and no gears to use for its advantage. This car is an engineering marvel, and not only was it quicker than every other steam car, it was more reliable. It could do in excess of 1,500 miles to a tank of water, which is pretty impressive, to say the least, compared to a modern petrol or diesel burner. And it could start up and drive far quicker than any other steam car because you have to prep the engine. Now, on the game, obviously, that's irrelevant. The car's always good to go whenever you select a vehicle to drive. So the main thing on the game would be how it would fit in. Obviously, it doesn't have that many rivals. Its primary rival would be probably the Hudson Hornet. That's about the closest thing we have on the game, maybe a couple of the electric cars. But it would still do pretty well against some of them. Give it some weight loss, potentially some upgrades. I doubt that we'd be allowed to upgrade the engine that much, if at all, because it's kind of a difficult engine to upgrade in comparison to a typical combustion engine. But were it on the game, even if we could only do things like weight loss, stiffening up the suspension, etc., it could still be a fantastic collector's piece. As far as PP, it's very hard to say. Probably somewhere around the 380 to 450 kind of region, something like that. Not much higher though, if higher at all. And as far as price, well, that's very difficult to say. I'd personally like to see it have anything from a price of about 150,000 credits or more. But I'd happily pay any price, to be honest, for this on the game, even into the millions. I doubt that it would be that expensive, but if it were, I'd happily pay it. So, a slightly shorter video than usual today, but the reason for that is because Jay Leno himself goes into great detail about the car, and there's just no need for me to repeat those same things again. So, if you are interested in learning more about this car, be sure to look down in the description for the link to Jay Leno's video on his channel, Jay Leno's Garage. And if you are new to this series, be sure to check out the other cars in the series, and also slap down below what vehicles you would love to see feature on a new Gran Turismo game, or GT6, although that seems relatively unlikely at this point. And for now, as always, thanks for watching.